All right, let's kick it up a notch and get super weird for a minute. Let's look at the third argument for the existence of God, the ontological argument. This was the third one I think you looked at in your thought primer. And it's an argument that relies on this concept of a greatest being, or a greatest possible being. And so before we look at the argument, we want to get clear in our own minds. What does it mean to say that something is the greatest? What does that mean? And I would submit to you that when we say that something is the greatest, we're saying that it's beyond everything else. It is the pinnacle of whatever type of thing it is. There is none better. There is none that is more awesome. We have reached the ultimate. Okay, when something is the greatest, we said there is no going beyond this. There is nothing beyond this in its class. This is the greatest. All are less than. All right, so now think about if you were going to conceive of or create the greatest possible being that could ever exist, what would be the qualities that this being would have? What would be the qualities that this being you've imagined as the greatest possible being would possess? All right, so Anselm thinks that just with this concept of greatest being, he can reason his way to a proof that God exists, okay? And you'll notice that Anselm is doing the same thing, that Richard Taylor is doing the same thing, that Aquinas was doing, and that is that they're using a priori arguments to justify their claim that God exists. In other words, they're not appealing to experiences or observations. They're not offering to you objective evidence that they collected from some experience. They're just using reasoning. And Anselm's saying, I have this idea of what it means to be the greatest possible being, and I think by deducing from that concept alone, I can arrive at the conclusion that God has to be an existing being. All right, so let's see how he does that. He does it by using this really clunky phrase, the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. All right, so how does he roll? Premise number one, I have within my understanding an idea of God. Okay, we probably do too. All you have to do is think of the God of any of the three major monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Think about the sort of attributes that God is portrayed to have, and we can have an idea in our imaginations about that God. And that idea is probably, if we're going with the monotheistic religions, this is the supreme being. This idea of God is the idea of the greatest possible being. Yes. That God in my imagination, based on those three religions, it's the ultimate. It is the being on which everything else depends. It is the greatest possible being. It's the pinnacle of beings. Now, Anselm says this, a being is greater if it exists in reality than if it exists only in the understanding. All right? What do you think of that? Is that true? A being is greater. It's more. It's more than. It's at the pinnacle if it exists in reality than if it's only existing in our imaginations. True or false? All right, then Anselm says, if God exists in the understanding alone, right, just as an idea in my imagination, then a greater being can be conceived. I can think of something even better than it's this God existing just in my imagination, namely one that also exists in reality. But, Anselm says, premise number 4 is kind of a contradiction because it says I can conceive in my imagination a greater being than the greatest conceivable being. So if I have an idea of the greatest conceivable being, such a being has to exist both in my understanding and in reality. Because, Anselm says, if it exists only in my imagination, I can imagine this other greatest being that would be even greater than that one that I know just exists in my imagination, namely one that not only exists in my imagination, but also in reality. That one would be greater than the one that's just an idea in my mind. Therefore, Anselm concludes, God exists in reality. All right, so if this conclusion, if we're going to reject this conclusion, we would have to come up here and find a premise or premises that we can doubt. Which of these premises do you think we can be skeptical of? Okay, I've already sort of indicated I don't think I can be skeptical of 1 or 2. I do think, though, that people raise questions about premise number 3 and 6. With regard to premise number 3, I've heard the critique, well, just because something exists in reality doesn't necessarily mean it's greater than if it exists only in your imagination. And an example I even read from a philosopher was, well, does that same thing hold true for a cancer cell? Is a cancer cell greater if it exists in my body than if it exists just in my imagination? And I thought, well, yeah, in the way that we're thinking about greater here, right? Not better than, not better for you. Yes, of course you don't want the cancer cell to exist in actuality in your body. But the fact that you don't mind having it in your imagination, but you do mind having it in your body, tells me that the one that's in your body that really exists is greater than. It's greater than the one in your imagination in the way that we're using greater here. It's real. And that's what makes it a threat. So yes, that one that exists in reality is greater than the one that you're just imagining. Okay, so premise number 3, we may be able to handle those critiques kind of in that way. But premise number 6 is one that really gets critiqued. Is it true that if I have an idea of the greatest conceivable being, then that being must exist both in my imagination and in reality? And so somebody will say something like, look, I can imagine the greatest tropical paradise that could ever exist. I can think of all of the features of that. Does that mean that that greatest tropical paradise suddenly comes into reality? It's like, no. Thinking something exists doesn't necessarily make it exist. And we could say the same thing about your claim in number 6, Anselm. Just because it would be greater if this God existed not just in your imagination but also in reality doesn't mean that it has to exist in reality. Now, Anselm may respond and say, look, you don't understand. This God, it's not that it has the quality of perfection. It is perfection. Okay? This greatest conceivable being is goodness. It is power. It is perfect. It is our perfection. Therefore, I'm not just imagining this God into existence. What I'm saying is this God wouldn't be what it is if it didn't also exist. It is perfection. And in order to be perfection, it has to exist. Might be a response that Anselm would offer us. All right, so let's look now at some a posteriori arguments, ones that rely on evidence and a different kind of reasoning for their proof.